drives me completely out of my mind to do nothing. I'm used to being occupied all the time. And so, but I'm very happy that I'm able to do these discussions. And so far that's been going well. So I'd like you to walk me through what's happened to you since the events in Evergreen and bring everybody up to date on my end. So, man, maybe you could start with what happened at Evergreen, although I suspect many of the people watching this do know. Does that seem reasonable?
Sure. Yeah, we can start there. I think we should probably err in the direction of being sparse with the details and see where it leads us.
Yep.
So in 2017, I was teaching at Evergreen, as was Heather, my wife, and she was literally Evergreen's most popular professor. I wasn't too far behind. I was very popular as well. Our classes were always overfull, and we accepted more people than we had to and had to turn some away anyway. And then in actually 2016, the new president of the college, George Bridges, began an initiative or a set of initiatives surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these initiatives included the impaneling of a committee that was supposed to look into racism at the college, its impacts, and to propose solutions. And as it became clear what they were alleging and proposing, Heather and I became very alarmed. And I began to speak out, at first in faculty meetings, and then when the ability to speak out in faculty meetings became non-existent, I took to our faculty and staff email list to talk about the threat to the college that was created by these initiatives. And that, of course, brought about exactly what you would imagine, which were accusations that I was motivated by some kind of racism or white supremacy or white fragility, or who knows what the accusations were exactly. But in any case, I fought back anyway. And my sense was I had tenure and I was well liked and I was well known at the college. I'd been there for 14 years. And so I didn't think they had the power to get rid of me. And that gave me the ability to say what needed to be said about these proposals. Well, the upshot is that ultimately protesters, 50 students that I had never met, showed up at my classroom, accused me of racism, demanded that I either be fired or resign. I told them I wouldn't. And riots broke out at the college in which faculty and administrators were kidnapped. I was apparently hunted car to car on campus by protesters. The police were stood down by the college president, and we were basically left to fend for ourselves with student patrols roving the campus with weapons, baseball bats, and the like. So it was a chaotic scene. There was a lot of interest in it because it was very colorful. But of course, most people back in 2017 dismissed this as, yes, an overreaction, but you know how college students are. And those of us who saw it up close knew that that couldn't be the case, that it would ultimately spill out into civilization. And we, of course, were right. And now it's everywhere. We see it taking over institution after institution. In the U.S. and Canada, we see it making tremendous strides in government, and there's no telling where it ends.
And what is, I mean, I have a bunch of questions that come out of that. So I'll lay out three. Why in the world did this bother you enough so that you took a stand, especially given your political leanings? Because you were, which I'm not criticizing, by the way, I'm just stating that it isn't obvious to begin with why it would be you that would take a stand, say, rather than someone else. But you did, and so I'm curious about why. And what is it that you saw coming? And what is this it that you're referring to? You've had a lot of time to be thinking about this now. It's been 4 years. And I mean, the other thing I want to ask you about is your life was thrown completely upside down, you and your wife. You don't have your job at the university anymore, either of you, despite the fact that you were tenured professors. It's not an easy thing to get another toehold in academia once you've been a tenured professor somewhere, especially if you've gone through what you went through, because no hiring committee anywhere is going to give you any consideration once you've been tarred by scandal, regardless of what your role in it was. They're far too conservative to ever do anything like that. And so, okay, so I don't know if I can remember the order in which I asked those questions, but I think the first one was, why in the world were you compelled to object, and what is it that you were objecting to, do you think?
Well, it's a funny question for you to pose to me, because I have the feeling that the answer will be entirely native to you. I literally don't believe I had any choice. People frequently ask me why I stood up, and my sense is, if I think through the alternative, I simply can't live with it. I can't sleep.
Yeah,
right?
But that doesn't seem to bother most people, so I don't get that. Well, why you?
Well, right. I mean, I guess that's the thing I'm discovering. So you alluded to my political leanings, and you and I both know what you mean by that. I'm a liberal, and I describe myself sometimes as a reluctant radical. By that, I mean that I believe we must engage in radical change if we are to survive as a species, but I also know that radical change is very dangerous. And so it's not like, I find most people who would call themselves radicals feel like radical change is always called for, and I don't. My sense is, I hope to see change that makes civilization good enough that I get to be a conservative, that I get to say, actually, we're doing so well that we have no choice but to preserve this. If we try to improve it, we'll mess it up. That's where I want to go. But what I'm discovering is that the bedrock of my liberalism is nothing like the underpinnings of the so-called liberalism of most of the people on the left side of the political spectrum. My liberalism comes from a sense that, yes, compassion is a virtue, but that policy must be based on a dispassionate analysis of problems. It is based on an understanding that the magic of the West comes from a tension between those who aspire to change things for the better, and those who recognize the danger of changing them at all. And so in any case, I think the short answer is, we look around the world and everybody makes arguments that sound as if they come from first principles, but most people do not arrive at conclusions from first principles. If they extrapolate at all, they don't do it very well. And that results in severe compartmentalization of thought. And that means that when confronted with changes that threaten a system on which we are dependent, most people don't recognize it. And if they do recognize it, they wouldn't know what to do about it. So how can I put it in plain terms? I had no choice, because I was as if on a ship where somebody had proposed to fix our course through a field of icebergs and navigate based on some absurd theory with no grounding in fact. Somebody had to object. And I was a little surprised at how few and far between the objectors were. But, if I'm to be totally candid about it, at the point that things went haywire at Evergreen, I had watched video of you reacting to protesters in Toronto. And it had made so much sense to me at a number of different levels. I recognized you as somebody who knew that although the initial proposals were arguably symbolic, that they were connected to things that ultimately were very much about an exercise of power and a transfer of well-being, and that it was therefore, you felt obligated to stand up and say no, which resulted, as you know better than anyone, in you being mocked for overreacting. And then here we are years later, and it turns out that you saw with absolute clarity what others couldn't even imagine.
Yes, but I certainly didn't see what was going to happen to me.
Right.
With clarity, so... been
Right.
quite
I
a
don't think
strange route.
it wasn't possible to see what would happen with specificity to you. But am I correct in seeing that you knew that something very dramatic was likely to come from your standing on principle, and that didn't provide any license to do anything but make that stand?
I really can't say, it's a while ago now, so that's part of it. But so much has happened to me that's been so strange in the last 4 years that I have a very difficult time making any sense of it. I can't even really think about, especially the last 2 years, I can't really think about them in any consistent and comprehensive way. I mean, my family situation has been so catastrophic, and my illness and my wife's illness, it's just been, although she recovered completely, thank God, it's just been so utterly catastrophic that my thinking about it is unbelievably fragmented. I'm struck dumb still to some degree by all of what emerged as a consequence of me making the first videos that I made. I went downstairs, talked to my wife and my son. My son was living at home at that time, temporarily. And I said, this piece of legislation is really bothering me because it calls for compelled speech. And I looked at the background documents and something wasn't right. And I said, I need to say something about it. They said, well, go for it. We'll see what happens. A
horde of power lichers. I'm not getting through there in a hurry.
And continues to break loose, for that matter, which is one of the things that's so bloody strange about it, is it doesn't seem to end. And I would have thought, when it first started, I thought, oh, well, I'd be a flash in the pan for a week or something, or 2 weeks, or a month, or 6 months, or a year, or 2 years, but it doesn't stop. And I really can't understand that. It's beyond my comprehension. Now, I guess it's partly because I continue to communicate my thoughts to some degree, even talking to mainstream media people, although increasingly less, and perhaps not at all from here on in. I mean, I had an interview with the London Times 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago it was published, and, it was just another complete, absolute bloody nightmare for my family, my daughter in particular, because they took her to task in an extraordinarily nasty way. And, and the journalist who did the interview was completely... You couldn't invent her. Not only the way she was so deceitful in what she did, but I learned more about her background afterward as a consequence of another journalist who wrote about her. And, she's a very singular person, to say the least. And so I did feel at the time, like you did, I guess, that I was more afraid of not speaking than I was afraid of speaking. And I have something against being told what to say. It's like, I'll pay the price for what I have to say. I'm not going to pay the price to say what you want me to say. You go say it yourself and see what the hell happens. And, maybe that's just a kind of incomprehensible stubbornness in some sense. Although I think I did see the beginnings of what has unfolded since then. Although I can't even really put my finger on what it is that's happening. So,
well, I wonder a little bit about, in some ways, there's nothing good about why you were absent from the scene. But there may be something good about your having not been there for every moment of it and being able to come back to the discussion with something like fresh eyes, because a lot of this is developmental. And, you say you're surprised that that this is continuing. And I must say, I'm having the same experience. I feel like I was picked up, my whole family was picked up by a tornado and we haven't been put down. And, I sort of feel like we were joined in the tornado during 2020. It was such a crazy year that a lot of people whose lives were continuing in some normal fashion are suddenly aware that things are wildly off kilter. But actually, this raises a question. I think one of the things that I know from my own life, and I know, of course, a bit about your life because of the fact that it's public and because I've met Tammy and have had a chance to interact with you in that context as well. But the question I have is, I wonder about the difference between a person who might think the way you or I would think about bad policy and, compelled speech and that sort of thing. The difference between a person who might think such a thing in isolation and a person who has a proper familial context in which to actually check in. So in other words, I have the sense that in part the reason that I'm able to just simply describe things as they are and do so unflinchingly is because my family understands the same puzzle, and they may have different elements that they see with clarity. But there's no question I can go to Heather and I can say, I ran into this thing today, and here's what I'm concerned it implies. And we can have a rational discussion about it without anybody accusing anybody of moral defects or any of the things that have become so common. And so in your case, I know that you have a familial network that provides you that same kind of reality check. And then I wonder, looking at the generation of people advancing the woke revolution, and I see the failure of that very thing. And I can't help but wonder if it isn't connected. In other words, the idea that that pair bonding, that marrying and producing a family has become something that most people don't even consider an essential part of life. It's not the objective of the exercise. It's a choice that some people make at best. That has left people very isolated from any reality check, which makes them very vulnerable when they are threatened with an accusation like you're a racist, you're a transphobe, that sort of thing.
Now, you definitely need, in this book, this is my new book, by the way, and so it's coming out March 2nd, and I sort of clung to this like a life raft over the last couple of years while I was writing it. There's a section in here about sanity, and it's a critique to some degree of psychoanalytic thought, because not that I admire the psychoanalysts tremendously, but they tended to think of sanity as something that was organized inside your psyche, or let's say inside your brain for that matter, or maybe even a reflection of healthy brain function. But sanity is to large part outsourced. And what I mean by that is that if you're fortunate and you're well socialized, other people find you acceptable enough to include you in their networks. And then all you have to do is pay attention to the functioning of that network and regulate your behavior as a consequence of the feedback you receive, and you more or less stay sane. And so, like, if you have a family and you have friends, then they'll help you make sure that your jokes are funny and not mean, because they'll laugh when they're funny and they'll raise an eyebrow when they're mean. And then you can check in with that, and they'll help you figure out if you're dominating the conversation too much, and they'll push and prod you as you do the same to them, and everyone stays relatively organized. And when all this hit to begin with, I had quite a large network of people, which expanded at some point to include people like you and the so-called intellectual dark web members, and they were helping me check in on my sanity all the time, helping guide me through the interview process, analyzing my errors and commenting when I did something hypothetically right, and my family played an integral role in that. And so that was extremely helpful. I never thought about that as a precondition for saying what I said, but I think there's something about that that's right. It's certainly the case that, like, I have tremendously supportive parents. Still, they're both still alive. They're still tremendously supportive at a very deep, deep level. And I think that was a real gift that I had that many people don't have. I've been struck, one of the things that torments me constantly is, and I think it's really hurt me to discover this, is I had no idea how deep the desperation was for people who lack encouragement. It's just because every time I talk about this, it makes me tear up because of what I've seen, I think. But all these people that I've met now, I spoke when I went on my book tour, which was an unbelievable event, unbelievably positive event, but also I would even say to some degree traumatically positive. Like it was just too much. I really loved it, but to see the depth of hunger that people had for an encouraging word was unbelievably tragic. And for people to come up to me repeatedly, over and over and over, hundreds, maybe thousands of times, and say, I was in such desperate straits, looking for some encouragement, unable to find it. And then, I came across your lectures. I thought, Jesus, it's pretty thin gruel to feed a starving population. I mean, I'm absolutely pleased beyond belief that people have found what I've done useful. But that doesn't decrease the impact of the realization of just how much hurt there is. And it is hurt that's grounded in a lack of encouragement. I have that. I've been encouraged my whole life. So, and that could easily be part of what. Now, I also thought somewhat in a calculated way about this, like, and I don't know how far this goes back, but I also organized my life so that I was standing. I had legs out in many directions. I had a clinical practice. I had a business. I had my professorship. I had my writing. I had multiple sources of income in pretty independent areas. And so I did that in part to maximize my capacity for freedom. I thought, and this wasn't something I think I thought explicitly, it was part of what unfolded in my life across time. It wasn't easy to take me out, although I've been taken out a lot, like far more than I thought might be possible. I can't separate that exactly from intrinsic health problems, but I despite my, it isn't obvious to me that I can go back to the university. I'm still employed there. I'm on leave. They would take me back. I don't know if I can do it. I don't have my clinical practice anymore, which I really miss. I love doing that. And that was 20 hours a week, so that's a lot of time. I finished writing this book, but I'm not writing right now. And so I don't have any pressing financial concerns. And so of course, that's a huge privilege, a huge benefit. And thank God for that. But despite me being distributed like that, I was still taken out pretty hard. So
yes, I confess I have wondered while you were incommunicado over the last year whether that was just Goliath's good fortune or if there might be something more to it, because you were such a singular voice at the point that Tammy got sick and then you did, that obviously it was a tremendous blow to those of us in intellectual dark web space in our ability to fight and to hold the line. But you clearly have been taken out, in your words, deliberately multiple times, and how it comes about. Continually. I don't know.
It's amazing to me that it continues to happen. And the thing that's so damn weird is that exactly the same thing continues to happen, and it was just replayed with this Times article. Now, I have thought, I had a lot of interviews lined up for this book. And once the Times article came out, I reacted to it, my family reacted to it, and we dealt with it effectively. The same thing happened that had happened to me before when journalists had written a hit piece about me. It was extremely stressful because when it happens, you do not know which way it's going to go. And, you can get unlucky and a number of bad things can happen to you simultaneously. All that has to happen is for that to happen once to exceed your capacity to deal with the number of bad things and you're out. That's basically an accident. And I really think that's what happened to me in the last few years, is that everything that happened socially was unbelievably stressful, positive and negative. You know, the positive end of it was extremely intense and amazingly compelling and interesting, but the negative end was really, really stressful. You know, and I notice what happens to people, generally speaking, and I don't think I'm making this up, is, you know, I've watched the typical person who gets mobbed on Twitter will get mobbed by 20 people. And it'll last for 2 or 3 days, and they'll apologize like mad. They're so stressed out, they retreat right away. And it's really hard on them. You know, and that happened to me, like, I don't know how many times, 100 times, 200 times, and really publicly. You know, I've been called every bloody name in the book, and that's been really, literally. I mean, I remember one day where I was called a Jewish shill and a Nazi the same day, you know, by 2 competing publications. And I thought maybe they canceled each other out, you know, but, and that's been very hard on my family, you know, and although they're doing reasonably well under the circumstances, but then, you know, Tammy got sick terribly and in a really nasty way. And then her surgery was complications multiplied, and she was near death daily for months. And then this proclivity I had for depression seemed to have become untreatable, and that took me out. And I'm still struggling with that. You know, I get up, I can hardly stand up when I wake up in the morning. I feel so bad. I can't believe I can be alive and feel that bad. I stumble downstairs and I'm in the sauna for about an hour and a half, and then I can stand up long enough to have a shower, which I do for about 20 minutes, and I scrub myself from top to bottom, trying to wake up. And then I can more or less get upstairs and I eat, and then I walk like 10 miles every day, because I need to do that in order to deal with this, whatever it is that's plaguing me. And I can get myself to the point where by this time in the afternoon, I'm more or less functional, but then it repeats the next day. And so, and it's so,
my God, that's terrible.
It is. It's terrible. It's so terrible. It's so terrible that I can't think about it without it being traumatic. So I have a hard time figuring out where to place my mind, because this has been happening. It's been happening every day, really, for 2 years. I think it's fair to say that every single day of the last 2 years has been worse than any day I had previous to that.
So, oh my goodness. And what a predicament you're in then, because, you know, I can hear, I would guess it anyway, knowing you and knowing of you in the way that I do, but you're caught in this predicament where that's really intolerable. And frankly, most people wouldn't tolerate it. But you also know that there is, you know, both at the level of your family and at the level of those who admire you and listen to you and are, you know, waiting to hear the little bits of affirmation that they need, the little bits of guidance that they were unable to get in the world. You know how much good comes from your facing that, what sounds like a completely excruciating existence.
Yeah, it's perverse beyond comprehensibility, which is sort of the hallmark of a traumatizing experience, because it is exactly that. And I look at it and I can't wrap my mind around it. And also my degree of exposure. I mean, you know, when I decided to make those videos, I was playing with YouTube. And I was playing with fire. Like, YouTube is fire in a way. Social media is fire in a way that is unimaginable. It's so powerful. YouTube, we'll see, but YouTube demolishes the printing press in terms of its long-term significance. I mean, because now you can do with video and audio what you did with print, and it's way easier. You have access to a massive audience with no intermediaries whatsoever. And, you know, I don't know really how to grapple with that either, how to comprehend it.
Well, I mean, actually, this brings me to one of the things I've been hoping to talk to you about for the longest time. So I think there's a part of you that finds you've always been very gracious about it and welcoming, but finds my liberalism a bit paradoxical.
No, I don't. Look, I understand the catastrophe of the Pareto distribution. I don't like it. There is this proclivity for capital to accrue in the hands of smaller and smaller numbers of people. It's just capital. It's all goods. You get this terrible problem of distribution that's like a natural law. And the fact that people object to that is completely unsurprising. And the fact that if it goes unchecked, it destroys societies I don't think that's a hypothesis. That's demonstrably self-evident. So I especially don't find the compassionate concern for working class people and their well-being the least bit incomprehensible. It's the solutions that are the problem. It's like, well, what should the solutions be? And well, that's where things get very, very complicated. It's not
well, perfect. And I'm sorry if I implied something that it wasn't even my perception. I think you are, to an extent, a conservative, but I find you, if I listen to you, it's not a simple kind of conservatism.
I'm a conservative for the same reason you are. You already pointed out, like, if you're a social scientist and you don't understand the law of unintended consequences, you are not a very good social scientist. I learned from my clinical research and from studying clinical research for so long and publishing it too, is that you think your intervention is going to do what you think it's going to do, but it isn't. It's going to do something else. And you have to build in, if you have an intervention that you think is going to have beneficial results, you have to build in an assessment to see if it has those results. And like, I talked to the woman who headed the name of it was done in not in Cambridge, but in Massachusetts. It was a longitudinal study of antisocial children, the first longitudinal study. It was done in a working class neighborhood just outside of Cambridge. I used to live there, and I can't remember the name at the moment. But in any case, this team intervened with kids that were likely to have they came from broken homes, broken neighborhoods, antisocial neighborhoods. This was done in the 1930s. And they intervened at the level of the child and at the level of the teachers and at the level of the parents, and ran this multiple-year project to reduce risk for negative outcomes among this population, randomly assigned participants to groups, and by all accounts from the participants, the children, the parents, the teachers, and the professionals who were running the investigation, it was a resounding success. They looked at the results, and the intervention group did worse on virtually every outcome measure. And they figured out later that the reason for that likely was that they took the antisocial kids and grouped them together in summer camp. They took them out of the city to put them in camp. They thought that would be a good intervention, but grouping them together seemed to produce a competition for antisocial behavior, and it overwhelmed all of the other interventions. That was Joan McCord, famous study. And I talked to Joan McCord a lot about that. But you see that all over the intervention literature. It's very hard to fix. It's very hard to define a problem correctly. It's very hard to develop an intervention that addresses that problem and only that problem. And then it's very hard to get the intervention to do what you want it to. And that's what makes me conservative to the degree that I am. So,
yep. No, I think that's incredibly wise. I would add one thing to your list. It's not just that it's hard to get an intervention to do what you want it to do. It is that it is hard to get it to do what you want it to do. And at scale, these things also tend to evolve. So even if you did manage to solve, right. And so the problem of unintended consequences, coupled with the problem of perverse incentives and therefore bad policy that is effectively corruption, is a very frightening problem. And so I do think we're caught in a basically damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. We can't stay here. And, I agree with you. The social media, for lack of a better term for it, is going to dwarf the printing press for various reasons. Some of them because it's so easy, but also because it's of a fundamentally different nature, right? When you're reading a book, it may be that somebody writes something that's bad for you to absorb, but you know you're reading a book because the experience of it, the perception of it is of a book. Whereas social media increasingly fools the mind into, the interaction you and I are having is more or less a face-to-face interaction. But a lot of interactions that look like face-to-face interactions don't have these characteristics. And at best, the impact on the mind is arbitrary. So, we're watching things like amplifiers of threat. Mm-hmm. And, this goes back to the thing we were discussing earlier.
But with Twitter, here's a good example of unintended consequences. It's like, what don't we know? Okay, we don't know what regulates human communication. We know that if you restrict the bandwidth, people don't understand each other as well, but we don't know how communication functions. It's too complicated. Okay, so we absolutely don't know what happens to communication at a large scale when you restrict people to 140 or 280 characters and then put them in a network with millions of other people. We have no idea. And it could be that you tremendously bias the discourse towards impulsive anger. It looks like that if you look at Twitter. And because it's 140 or 280 characters, you can whip something off very quickly. And so it's almost as if the technology is implicitly commanding you to be impulsively aggressive. And then we don't know what it means when only those people who are motivated to be impulsively aggressive that day are those that are communicating. And then when you only see those communications, even though, 10,000 people might read your tweet, only 100 who are irritated for some reason respond. We don't know any of that. And we completely underestimate the power of the technology because it looks harmless. It just sits there on your phone and doesn't do anything. And so, God only knows what kind of Tower of Babel that is. So,
right. And not only that, but the fact that the algorithm changes and we don't get any notice of it. Not only do we not have access to whatever the algorithm's content is, but we don't know when it changes, which means it's impossible for us to even track the impact of our own behavior because we can't run a controlled experiment.
It's like predicting the stock market. It's an illusion that you're dealing with the same thing every day. It's complete illusion. Right. And then, of course, we don't know, the algorithms increasingly have a life of their own, and increasingly they're governed by artificial intelligence. And it derives implications that we don't even understand. And as you pointed out, it all changes so quickly that we can't keep up with it in any event. So, yes. So,
right. So then the conversation, and I'm certain it's going to take multiple tries for us to get there. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity for multiple discussions. But the question is, all right, you're a conservative, but you're a wise conservative that understands the importance of liberalism, understands the necessity of tension between the desire not to mess things up with unintended consequences and the desire to solve problems that are actually solvable. And I would argue the necessity to solve certain problems, which will be fatal if we don't solve them. But the combination, in other words, I think there's a new dialogue that has to happen. Those conservatives who understand the puzzle need to get together with those liberals who understand the puzzle and figure out what the new insights are, because we are somewhere so novel that if there's one thing we can say, it's that our system is unstable and it is putting us in great jeopardy. Which means that even if your impulses are conservative, and you point out correctly that I have some conservative impulses, even if your impulses are conservative, we aren't anywhere, right? We're on a precipice in a windstorm, and at some level, we have to make enough progress relative to the fundamental instability of the system and the fundamental, here, let me take an example. The point you make about social media and the human psyche, you could make exactly the same point about pharmaceuticals and physiology. that we know very little about the way the body actually works.
Yeah, I can sure make that case all right.
Yeah, I'll bet you can. The hell you've been through makes this point very clearly. But, I'm constantly struck by the fact that our narrative about medicine proceeds from an entirely false premise, which is that we know a great deal about the body and have all of these useful interventions. What we have is a lot of interventions where sometimes we know what one of their effects is. We very rarely understand why the spectrum of, collateral consequences are what they are. And all of these systems are linked together, and nobody is tracking the long-term implications of anything. So we have this sort of obsessive focus on the things that you can detect on very short time scales, and almost a studied ignorance of what the same pharmaceuticals or procedures do to us long-term. Right. And we then,
I suspect if you did these statistics properly, I suspect that medicine, independent of public health, kills more people than it saves. I suspect if you factor in phenomena like the development of superbugs in hospitals, for example, that overall the net consequence of hospitals is negative. Now that's just a guess, but it could easily be wrong, but it also could not be wrong, and that is a good example, or that's where my thinking about what we don't know has taken me with regards to the critique of what we do.
The fact that it's even plausible is a stunning fact.
Well, medical error is the third leading cause of death.
Yep.
And that doesn't take into account the generation of superbugs, for example.
The generation of superbugs, or, if you're thinking broadly about it, I don't know where you stand on this issue, but I have been tracking the lab leak hypothesis for COVID, and it is very distressing to me that as much as it's an unsettled question, the evidence for the lab leak gets stronger over time. All of the competing hypotheses fall one by one and are replaced by some alternative that hasn't yet been falsified. But that's very ominous to me. And if this is the case, if this was a bug that was modified in the lab through gain-of-function research and escaped, then you have to add that to the balance sheet with respect to the costs of medical errors, because it looks like, if this was an escapee from the Wuhan lab, that it was an escapee from experiments designed to create a vaccine to protect us from future coronaviruses. So we can't say that with specificity, but if we look at the circumstantial evidence of what was being studied, how it was being studied, and what the likely purpose of those investigations were, then this is, the mother of all self-inflicted wounds, and it is downstream of naive thinking about the cost-benefit ratio of enhancing the infectivity of viruses.
I did know that that's something that you've been tracking and pursuing. I don't have an opinion about it because I don't know enough about it to have an opinion. So I'd also, with regards to conservatism, I don't know if approaching how people should deal with the problems in their lives from a psychological perspective, the viewpoint of a clinical psychologist, I wonder if that kind of automatically makes you conservative in some way, because my locus of concern has always been the individual, and so and individual well-being, and being trained as a behavioral psychologist, I always took as my unit of analysis the enhancement of well-being, of health, let's say at the individual level, and maybe translated into political, and when that's translated into the political landscape, maybe that looks something like conservatism. I don't know. I mean, I never thought about this. I never thought about what I was doing in political terms to begin with. Like, even my initial statement about Bill C-16 and compelled speech wasn't supposed to be something specifically political. I just thought the political had escaped its boundaries. It's like, no, you don't get to infringe on free speech. You're no longer in the political realm at that point. That's a different realm. Get the hell back where you belong. That's how it looked to me. But, everything, that's another thing that's very peculiar about our culture at the moment. It's almost impossible to have a discussion about anything and have the coverage not be politicized. And I think that's partly a function of how the media, the legacy media work, because they tended to view everything through a political lens, and also a consequence of this insistence, and this, I think, comes primarily from the radical left, that everything is political. And I don't buy that. It's like, you can say that everything has a political aspect, but that's a completely different claim than everything is political, which is a totalizing claim. And I also, as a social scientist, don't like totalizing claims, because most things are multivariate complex. And so,
yeah, I think we can prove that you can politicize everything, but not everything is political, and that the tendency to view everything in political terms destroys our ability to properly navigate questions on which we actually ought to have alignment. And this is it's a very disturbing pattern to see every question, including COVID itself, turned into a team sport, because that is, of course, sabotaging exactly the ability to reason through our various options and then to get us to move in a coordinated direction to actually address the pandemic. And in some sense, I suspect we are headed to having to accept COVID as a permanent fact of the landscape, when that was not a foregone conclusion, that in effect our politicizing of this issue is going to leave us with a bug that we can't ever get rid of.
Why do you think that? Like, I mean, I've been hoping that, and watching Israel in particular, there seems to be some indication that they've got the vaccinations ramped up to the point where they're having some